the violins of autumn wound my heart with a monotonous languor.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight. Today I am very glad to be here with Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon OBE. He's a former British Army officer and one of the UK's leading experts on CBRN, or chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear weapons, having served for 23 years in the armed forces. Since leaving full-time service, he has remained deeply involved in countering chemical weapons use, especially in Syria, where he's investigated attacks, advised humanitarian organisations and helped train on chemical threats. He's also a senior advisor to the UK MOD on CBRN issues and a frequent media commentator on warfare, deterrence and authoritarian aggression. He's the author of Chemical Warrior, Syria, Salisbury and Saving Lives at War. Mr. de Bretton-Gordon, thank you very much for coming onto the programme.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Well, you've spent a long and storied career in the British Army. What were your initial motivations to join?
Well, I come from a very long line of soldiers. My father was a soldier. My grandfathers on both sides were soldiers. And my great-grandfather was also a soldier. So in a way, it was sort of preordained and being brought up. My father served for 40 years. So I suppose in a way it was sort of, it was in the blood. At university, I studied agriculture. Sort of other sides of my family come from the farming community. But I think it was not preordained exactly. I mean, I didn't do any CCF at school or I didn't do any OTC at university. But the lifestyle, the way, the job, and also the desire to serve, I think, that's exactly what the military, the army was to me. And it seemed to be a natural progression. And, 24 years, I'm still a reserve officer now. So 37 years and counting. I'm not sure I'd have, done it any differently.
You mentioned the desire to serve. What does that mean to you?
Well, I mean, I think it's really piqued my sort of interest now, really what's going on, and questioning the whole business of serving. I think it's people get rather sort of wrapped around the axles. People think serving in the military is serving the government, as it were, which is absolutely not. It's serving the nation. It's protecting the people, and it's trying to make a difference. And I've been really touched by Corporal Hooley, who was killed in Ukraine last week. Came back. His death letter that we all write before we go on operations has been published today, and it is just a heart-rending story of service, desire to serve, desire to do the right thing, desire, to protect the nation. So that to me, I think it's a responsibility. And in relative peacetime, relatively few of us are called to do it. In wartime, it involves the whole of society. And I think it's something we're really grappling with at the moment. The angst that's being created by the M of MI6 brief on Monday, Chief of the Defence Staff talk on Monday night, saying, not that we're close to war. The nation needs to start thinking about it because if we stumble into a war and we haven't thought about it, we're going to be back in that sort of 1939 position. So I think it's very important that people do think about that because ultimately, not everybody can stick their heads in the sand. You do need people to get up and serve. And that's what I've been doing for 37 years. And as I think I said at the beginning, I wouldn't have it any different.
And why is the UK and the other democracies, why are they nations worth serving?
Well, I think when you're in a country and you're part of it, your friends and everything else is what service is about. I was very fortunate to spend a year in Australia with the Australian Army, and the whole ethos of Australia, they call it the mateship, that everybody is in it together, whatever your shape, colour, size, political leaning. That is what builds a nation together. So to me, absolutely. And lots of people are questioning. And I've just written a piece in the Telegraph today exactly about it. And the amount of people who are going, well, I'm not going to serve this country. I think that they're conflating two different things. I think, a lot of people don't like the current government, but that's different from the country. Luckily, we live in a democracy and we can, if we want, we're going to have a vote in whatever it is, 2 years' time. If we don't like the government, we get rid of them. That's not the case in places like Russia or Iran or North Korea. So democracy, I think, is really, really important. And to me, that's what service is all about. Just having been in the army, I've lived all around the world most of my life. I've lived much more of it out of the UK than in the UK, and certainly spending a lot of time in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And Syria. I can absolutely assure people, however miserable they think it is here, it's a damn sight better than most of the countries that I've had to fight in.
In your history of service, was there a particular moment or deployment that most shaped how you now have come to understand geopolitical power and responsibility?
Well, I think that's quite a big ask, quite a big question. I think undoubtedly Syria. I mean, Syria to me, I mean, it is ingrained in my psyche, and anybody who's read my book will know what a compelling time, despite the fact, having fought in the Gulf Wars and Afghanistan, which were all very, very moving. Syria was quite frankly the most compelling thing for me. And of course, I was there not as a soldier, as a civilian, and I was hugely frustrated that helping the Syrian people who are under attack from their own government and also the Russians were left to their own devices. And there were only a few people like me who actually went in to help them. And after a struggle of over 10 years, well, no, 12 years, in fact, I was back in Syria this year, the invitation of the new government. The irony of it was not less lost on me. The Mohammed al-Shara, the new leader, who of course stems from a jihadist, Al Qaeda, Al Nusra, and ISIS. Speaking with his team, telling me how ironic it was that for 10 years they tried to kill me, and now they're asking for my advice. And I'm not trying to be trite here, but the point is that somewhere like Syria that seems so intractable, let's not forget, Assad probably killed about 500,000 civilians, and the place was devastated and shocking. But to go back this year and see a free country with all its complexities, of course, a lot of people immediately dismiss it because al-Sharat used to be a jihadist. A very good friend of mine was Al Qaeda's head chemical weapons guy for a number of years, a chap called Ayman Dean, who then worked for Britain. He was a double agent and did tremendous service. His book, Nine Lives, is a must read for anybody who's interested in warfare. So, things change and are different. But Syria to me is, for somewhere that was so desperately horrendous and with no apparent solution, again, with Russian DNA all over it, actually now is pretty good. I felt safer in Damascus than I did in a recent holiday in Marrakesh and, down in Morocco, for instance. And there's tremendous opportunity. So it really gives me help. That's why, to me, it's most profound that actually things can be desperate. The many years I spent in Syria, I was terrified every moment I was on the ground and never thought that anything would come good of it. But now a lot of the Syrian doctors I ran within Syria have all moved, who are based in the UK. A lot of them have moved back. A lot of them hold important positions in the Syrian government and running the Syrian health service. And it's amazing. And you walk around Damascus and everybody's got a smile on their face, which, you couldn't be said for a lot of countries around the world at the moment.
And a lot has been said about Syria and the failure to back up the red line statements made by the White House. What are the consequences of that we're feeling today? And especially, I'm thinking about Russian aggression in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Europe.
Well, I think it is incredibly profound. I was in Syria at the time in 2013 a lot. I came back to the UK and tried to brief politicians after the big Ghouta attack in August. People might remember the UK government had a vote in September of whether they should strike the Assad chemical weapons plants, and it was decided not to. I was actually in the House of Commons that day trying to get MPs on all sides of the House to understand the situation, which they really didn't do. And I think that has had a profound effect. I think Putin looked very closely at that, and it should have been. I mean, this was a massive event. The most powerful man in the world had said he would do something if somebody used chemical weapons, and he didn't. And it killed 1,500 people, and Assad remained in power for another 11 years because of that. And I think when Putin looked west on the 24th of February 2022, he was pretty much certain that the West would do nothing. And of course, we didn't, certainly initially. And it's a rather surprise to him that actually we then got involved. So his 3-day operation is now approaching the 4th year. 1.5 million Russian soldiers are dead or injured. God knows how many Ukrainians and Ukrainian civilians. So, yeah, I think the Obama red line is a profound thing. And each time you hear people saying, this is a red line, that's a red line, a lot of going, what does a red line mean? It's about how thick that red line is. Unfortunately, most of them are pretty opaque because nobody's prepared to back it up. So, yeah, I blame the Obama red line for a hell of a lot of the bad things that have happened since. And it's going to take something pretty profound to, redraw a red line that people would take notice of in the future, I think.
Do you think the red line of sovereignty in the Treaty of Westphalia is very much up for grabs now?
Well, I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, we shall see. I think when things, when it certainly comes to the European theatre, as it were, I would hope people, will be a lot more focused. I think that the trouble with Syria is that, certainly the argument that people like Ed Miliband gave was this was a repeat of Iraq 2003, which, having been part of that as a soldier, we all agree that was a devastating mistake. What the argument I was trying to give to people like Ed Miliband is it was different. This was not the same. And for whatever reason, they wouldn't listen. But when it comes to Europe, I think that this is different. And eventually, the European countries, are being galvanized. Now, it might well be that, whatever President Trump does or doesn't do, the one thing he has managed to do is galvanize Europe to work together, galvanize Europe to recognize that our defense we are the only ones who can guarantee it. And therefore, we are slightly in a better position, but we shall see. I mean, it's very easy to see some of the fissures already beginning to start. We currently have the big issue today of whether Europe is going to use frozen Russian assets, which seems like a no-brainer. But you've got a Belgian government whose main source of income is looking after the banking system of Europe and the world, who's worried about completely losing their livelihoods, which, in a micro way you can sort of appreciate. But, when you look at what else is happening in Europe, you sort of, you can't, it's difficult to understand. So I think things are still pretty uncertain the way things are going to go. But, the key European powers, anything to do with Europe, I think is going to be something they're going to focus on more clearly than perhaps they have done in the past on things that are sort of seen over the horizon.
I think seizing the assets is a no-brainer as well. One of the main arguments made against it is the potential withdrawal of funds from other countries like China, India, etc., and loss of confidence in the EU as a secure market. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that is a fair argument. Absolutely. However, it's a red line issue, isn't it? This is Russian money that is sat there. And you're right, that is the challenge. People are worried about Chinese money withdrawn. But again, I think all of that is counterproductive. I think we need to look at it on a case by case basis. At the end of the day, that money, will not even touch the surface of rebuilding the damage that's been done in Ukraine. I can quite see all the counter arguments and everything else, but one must discourage this type of activity. And the Chinese, I think the Chinese are far more canny than perhaps some people give them credit for. Their whole way of life, their whole raison d'etre is based on economic power, and that economic power is what drives everything they do and drives their sort of military capability. But they also know that the result of that economic power is mainly Americans and Europeans. They are the ones who are spending the vast amounts of money on Chinese goods and services. It's not the Russians, it's not North Koreans, it's not the Iranians. And I think they know that. So, I accept that argument, but I think on this particular case, I would use those assets for the support of Ukraine and take the risk, because I think it's with all these things, it's a balance of risk, and I think the balance of risk in this case is in favor of using that Russian money.
Do you think that there are many in the West who still misunderstand how these modern authoritarian states are operating?
Entirely, I do, absolutely, and I think there is. I mean, there are a number of things. That's a very complex question, and it's very difficult to do it justice in a couple of sound bites. I think first of all, until fairly recently, a lot of Western countries have been cowed and feared Russia massively. Since day one of the war, Putin and Peskov and Medvedev and all the other, shouters in the Kremlin have been threatening Europe with nuclear attack virtually every single day. Now, I think this is a complete anathema, chimera, however you want to do it. Putin knows that mutually assured destruction absolutely works. And that's why we have had peace for 85 years. There is no way, I don't think, on earth he is going to use a nuclear weapon. I will come on to the chemical weapons in a bit, because he's using a lot of those in Ukraine at the moment. But I think that fear has constrained a lot of thinking, across Europe. I think also people, don't. I mean, the whole way that an autocratic dictator like Putin works is, again, not really understood in the West. I mean, people can see Russians driving around in black Rolls Royces and appearing to have lots of money and all the rest of it. Well, yeah, maybe, but that's sort of 0.1% of the society. People sort of think that the super rich in this country, are whatever 0.5% of the population. Well, there are thousands of that in Russia, and there are 1,000 times more rich. So, if you're an oligarch and close to Putin, you can go very well, particularly if you make sure you're filling up Putin's coffers. The vast majority of Russians are living in what we would consider poverty. I find it extraordinary that the Russians, having lost 1.5 million soldiers, that the babushkas, the mothers of Russia, aren't complaining a bit more. People may be aware that when Russia invaded Afghanistan in the 80s, after they had 17,000 casualties, the babushkas marched on the Kremlin, and the Kremlin capitulated and left Afghanistan. And I keep asking that question of Russian experts, and they tell me it's because soldiers are seen as mercenaries. A Russian soldier gets paid about 3 times the national living wage. My own son's a soldier. If he got paid 3 times the national wage, he'd be pretty happy. And that is the reason I understand that the Russians are not getting angsty, because they don't really care about all these soldiers dying, because they think they're rich and their families get a big payout if they're killed. Conversely, of course, the average Russian, if he can get petrol for his car now, it's 3 times the price. If you can, basic foods, or everything is getting difficult. And you just, I mean, one gets a download of the Russian papers every day. The Moscow papers, even the Moscow papers are now starting to talk about this economy that's grinding down. But going back to your original question, no, I think people are very slowly realizing quite what Putin is all about and what he's doing. And that is why I think we've been so slow to react. But even so, there a lot of people, particularly in this country, are more worried about what's happening here, not unsurprisingly, than what's happening in Ukraine and Russia.
And you touched on chemical weapons use in Ukraine. I'm aware from friends and contacts there that we've seen use of CS and tear gas dropped by drones, especially. But could you provide a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been directly involved in trying to support, help, and train Ukrainians how to deal with this. The main chemical that's been used is something called chloropicrin, which is a First World War choking agent. The Russians use it as a right control agent too, which is why they're trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. It is designated a chemical weapon under the Chemical Weapons Convention. The last report the Ukrainian military put to the United Nations detailed 12,000 uses of this on the front line. I speak to some brigades who are hit 3 or 4 times a day, even as recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it's had a hell of a really real impact. If you can imagine, if you're in a trench and this stuff falls in it and you don't have a respirator or a gas mask, anybody who's had a whiff of CS gas or been in a riot knows how unpleasant it is. I mean, you just can't hang around. And it's forced soldiers out of trenches, and then they've been hit and killed with conventional fire. I mean, the modus operandi for the Russians to use it is straight out of their use of chemical weapons handbook. Now, I think the real concern for people like me and others who look at this is if they escalate, and I know that's a real concern for the Ukrainians too. It's one thing firing industrial amounts of chloropicrin in trenches. What would happen if they decided to use Novichok? I'm talking to you from Salisbury today, where the Russian Novichok attack happened in March 2018. Now, if the Russians decided to use that, we would be looking at tens, not hundreds of thousands of potential casualties. Now, whether the Russians still have an extent chemical weapons program is for debate. But I think my personal view is, and having seen chemical weapons used so often in Syria so effectively, I sort of rather glibly say if you have no morals or scruples, you'd use chemical weapons all the time. I was in Aleppo in December 2016 when the Russians and Syrians had fought conventionally for 4 years and got nowhere. They then used sort of 17 days of chlorine barrel bombs and took the city. So these things are really, really impactful and effective. And I go back to the morals and scruples piece. I don't think Putin has any morals or scruples. And if he thinks that using a chemical weapon, a more toxic chemical weapon would work, I think he certainly will. And my concern is driven by the fact I don't think he can use his tactical nuclear weapons for the reasons I've said. But look back to the Obama red line we've been talking about. Are we going to do anything? Well, we haven't really done anything with 12,000 uses of a prescribed chemical weapon yet. So would we do anything if he decided to use something like Novichok, which is 10,000 times more deadly than chloropicrin? You would have to say probably not. And I think that is probably the thought process that Putin would have.
Do you think that there has to be a different level of taboo? I mean, he wouldn't use tactical nuclear weapons because any use of nuclear weapons would breach the nuclear taboo. Of course, they're of questionable effectiveness anyway. But is there not a difference between a CS type chemical weapon, being a CS is very unpleasant, I recall it well, and Novichok in terms of the taboo that would hold and the potential response?
Well, you would hope so. Absolutely. But But Assad used sarin nerve agent, which is not well. It's the same family as Novichok. It's a nerve agent, and about 500 kilos of sarin killed 1,500 people in Ghouta on the 23rd of August 2013. So yeah, I think the ambiguity behind the West's response to what happened in Syria um, might be a similar case with Russia. I would hope it's not. But I have been surprised, and I've been pushing the British government at least to make a demonstrative statement about the current use of chemical weapons in Ukraine. But we haven't had it. If you dig deep, you can see a few comments in the UN from the British ambassador to the UN saying, this is a not very good thing to do. But that doesn't push the bar. It doesn't push the needle at all. So yeah, it does concern me that people, like our prime minister and others across Europe, are not being more demonstrative about this because, again, it goes back to Putin's thinking and what he's prepared to do. And I think he's prepared to do anything except use nuclear weapons.
And what would be a correct sort of response if such an attack were to occur in Ukraine?
Well, I personally believe some sort of overwhelming conventional response is really the only thing that we can do. Whatever people might think, we don't have chemical weapons ourselves, so you couldn't do a like for like response. I think what is pretty clear is that even European NATO countries vastly overmatch anything the Russians have got. I mean, if you think NATO countries have about 140 F-35 Bravos that they could use at any minute, and we know that the F-35s are sort of impervious to Russian air defense. So, and we know that from the attack on the Iranian nuclear power plants, earlier on this year. So, a massive response, conventional response, I think, is what we have to do. But I think the fact that we haven't said that, and the trouble is, if you ask the Prime Minister why we haven't said that, he will probably say something like, "Well, we want the ambiguity to change Putin's thought process." But I personally don't believe that he gives a damn about that. He will do things to try and achieve his aims. And as head of MI6, said on Monday, Putin's aim is the complete subjugation of Ukraine and the provocation of NATO. So when you look at that, you sort of realize that actually we need to articulate exactly what we're going to do, and then we need to do it. But again, going back to the red line, he was commanding then as he is now. So I think it's very difficult to get Putin to really do anything, and his whole style, even this week, is I don't care, I'll do whatever I want because you lot in the West, he thinks we're weak and he thinks we won't really do anything, and unfortunately, he's got a bit of a point there, and it's up to us to change that metric.
You mentioned the provocation of NATO. How strong is NATO's Article 5 as a deterrent now, especially after the NSS from the United States?
Well, that again, that is something that needs reaffirming, I think. Now, if we were in the Baltic states or perhaps the Nordic states, Finland and Sweden, stand fast Norway a little bit, I think we'd be having a slightly different conversation. As far as they're concerned, they're absolutely relying on Article 5. And they are absolutely assuming that we will help. And they will absolutely fight like demons if there is an Article 5 event. And in a way, I think that, their demonstration of that is probably a good thing. Lots of people are saying, is Putin going to open up a new front, Lithuania or even, up in Finland? Well, all those countries have absolutely, said that they're ready. And you only look at the Baltic states have now sort of put a 40-mile deep border, full of trenches, dragon's teeth, mines, etc., that Russia would find it, very, very difficult. I think their ability to maneuver anyway as an army is pretty much non-existent. So, yeah, I mean, the Article 5, and you could argue some of the activities we've seen and articulated by MI6 earlier this week, could be seen as Article 5 anyway. I mean, the blowing up of the Polish railways last week or the week before, that the Poles have clearly said that was, KGB activity, and in a way that could be construed as an Article 5. But again, I think the Russians are playing with the ambiguity. But I do clearly believe that if Russian tanks roll across the border any further west than Ukraine, then there would be a response. And it goes back to your point about, what would we do if there's a big chemical attack in Ukraine? One would hope that NATO has up its sleeve some very large conventional response, probably using air power to something like that, that would be enough to stop any incursion or whatever is being done to stop that. I don't know that for a fact at all, but looking at the capabilities we have, one can be pretty certain that we could mount that sort of attack. I mean, the other thing to say, I mean, I found it very compelling, the Russian reaction to the threat of American Tomahawk missiles potentially going to Ukraine. Now, again, that's it's not a game changer or anything like that, but something like a Tomahawk missile that we know that the Russians probably can't shoot down has a range, 1,500 miles well into Russia. I mean, Trump even, was it a couple of months ago, asked Zelensky whether he could post one through the window of the Kremlin. He probably could if he had them. So, but the fact that when there was a talk about Tomahawk missiles about a month ago, suddenly the Kremlin woke up and Putin woke up and, got terribly excited about it, because actually for all the low-level tactical ingenuity we're seeing from the Russians, when it comes to the sophistication, particularly of long-range missiles, which seem to be a real currency of war now, they're no match for Western technology.
I want to move on a little bit to the state of democracy and the state of democracy in the established states. In your view, what are the most serious threats that our democratic societies are currently facing, and are they internal or external or a hybrid?
Well, I mean, that's going into politics is sort of, slightly out of my sort of range, as it were. But I think the biggest threats to democracy is people not realizing how good a democracy we have at the moment. And I think we've got a particular problem in this country. Again, people conflating the government with the nation. And at the moment, as has been the case, for several hundred years, we have the ability every 5 years to vote for a different government. And however hard people are thinking in this country at the moment, the current government was voted in, whatever it was, 18 months ago, with a massive majority. And that means, a lot of people who perhaps voted then probably didn't think deeply enough of what they were doing and what were the implications. But at least in our democracy, people have got a chance to change that in a couple of years' time. So I think there are so many conflating things. And I think the rise of the ultra-left and the ultra-right, not just in this country, but across Europe, are really destabilizing and a real concern. And, it was not dissimilar. Again, we talk about the 1930s, but there are parallels there. And I think there does come a time when things get really challenging, when it is the extremists on both sides of the political spectrum who seem to have sway and have, undue influence. It is the sort of the majority in the middle, the silent majority who don't lean into it. So I think it's democracy. I can't remember the exact terms and what they said. It's not perfect, but it's the best we've got at the moment. And you look at countries that are autocratic, uh, like Russia, like Iran, like North Korea, and hitherto places like Syria, where there was no chance, there was no liberalization of politics. You got what you got, and they're brutal regimes. So yeah, nothing. They're not perfect at the moment, but it's up to us to make sure that democracy survives. And it's never going to be perfect. But as we often say in the military, perfection is frequently the enemy of good. 80% is a lot better than perfection at 100% that you're never likely to achieve.
And this is something I ask all of my guests. But when I say the word freedom, democracy, and then service, for you especially, what do those words actually mean? Because they're bandied about as virtuous concepts, but I don't think there's enough discussion on the actual normative value of them.
Well, yeah, because it's such a big area. One person's freedom, is another person's servitude. And it really depends how you gauge these various things. You know, freedom of speech. Often hear some of the ultra-right Americans saying there's no freedom of speech in this country, which I find
Yeah.
bizarre. I mean, there are some odd cases where people post stuff on Twitter or X or whatever it is, and then get a call from the cops, which I just don't understand. I mean, there's sort of stuff. I only have to read the comments on my Telegraph column today from some people. I know half the ones that are saying some ridiculous stuff are Kremlin cronies anyway. I do say to them, I'm amazed how many how many people in the Kremlin subscribe to the Daily Telegraph. It's unbelievable. So I think the to me, freedom and democracy are all sort of one. But in order to keep that freedom and democracy, it requires people to serve, and people like me, as a professional soldier, I feel that is absolutely my role and job to do. And once things start falling down, then that's when everybody else gets involved. But it is, yeah, it is many things to different people. To me, it's fairly binary and fairly simple to go about my life as I see fit, unhindered by others. I don't like being taxed through the nose, and I think a lot of people in my stage of life at the moment sort of feel it's hardly worth going to work because what's the point? But you're never going to earn it. You're just paying taxes. But then again, I sort of think, well, that is probably our role to make sure that the government has enough money to run on. But then I sort of think, well, do I really want to? When you hear that, for some people, it doesn't make sense to work because they get paid too much in welfare. I mean, that is just completely bonkers to me how we're in that sort of position. And again, I dabbled with politics a few years ago because I certainly my time in Syria and the inability of the UK to help the Syrian people, I thought was crass. And I thought maybe I could, if I became a politician, I'd change it. But then I realized first of all, how poor most of our politicians are, poor as in capability rather than in wealth. And actually, they can't really do much anyway, which is frustrating. In a democracy, you would hope that that's the case. But at the end of the day, it's all the parties are like super tankers and cannot change quickly. So an inadequate answer to your question, but it's many different things to many different people. But at the end, I think it's being able to do what you want to do.
I've got two groups of people I'd like you to give some advice to from your wealth of experience. Firstly, in Germany, a law was very recently passed for mandatory military registration, not conscription, just registration. And that was met by waves of protests from people saying that they would never serve, even in extremis. What would you have to say to those people, and what advice perhaps do you have to offer them?
Well, I mean, I slightly sympathise. Somebody who has served and fought in three wars and spent probably too long in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. I know, war is horrendous, and
Mm.
you've got to avoid it at every opportunity. And the thought of it is horrendous. And I think for the Germans, there is still that massive legacy of the Nazis and the Second World War. But also it's a challenge, and I think the German situation is really an example for the rest of us. They have gone full 180 degrees probably since Frederick Merz became the Chancellor. Sudden realization that actually Germany is the one country that can make a real difference in Europe, and Germany is absolutely in the sights of Putin. So that realization. Now, and I think things like what the Germans are doing, 200 billion on defense, talking about military registration, to me, that is creating a conventional deterrence that we should have had years ago. I would contest if Putin had looked west in 4 years ago and seen a German army that they're trying to build for next couple of years. He would have realised that it's not worth doing stuff. And again, I think for the people who don't want to fight, I think it's the same in this country. The amount of derision that we've heard after the chief of the general staff talked about national resilience and defence is everybody's business. I just look at my own social media feeds, people going absolutely bonkers. And you go, well, what do? You either serve or you capitulate. And capitulation has never been a good thing. So my message to those people is prepare for war in order to prevent it. Strength has always been something that dictators like Putin have respected, and weakness is exploited. So if you don't want to go to war, then make sure that you are so strong that nobody's going to attack you. And for those Germans who are being called the same elsewhere. I mean, look, I'd say to them, look at the Finns. The Finns can put over 1 million men and women in the field in a couple of weeks because everybody is trained. Everybody realizes that, particularly with their position and the fights they had with the Russians in the Second World War, it is up to them. The same with the Swedes. Obviously our national psyches are different, but I personally think the Finns and the Swedes and the Swiss are a little bit the same, but they're a slightly different case here. The best way to prevent war is to prepare for it, and that's what the Germans have been asked to do.
Si vis pacem para bellum, although I think that's the Royal Navy's thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I say to some of my friends in London, is that all of these arguments hit very differently when the shaheeds are overhead.
Yes.
And on the flip side, what advice do you have, briefly, for a young man or woman considering service?
Well, I mean, I absolutely would encourage them. Yeah, my own son is at Sandhurst at the moment. Now, not through any encouragement of my own, I would say. I mean, but again, like him, he's a sort of fifth or sixth generation. We have it in our blood. I think when you look at it purely as a job, and service is never job, the military is never a job. Actually, it is a great experience. I think that there are a lot of people in this country saying, "Oh, we need national service so that young men and women can learn some values, gain some good skills, get off their backsides, get fit, etc., etc., etc." Which is not really the way that I look at it at all. I think for young men and women who are looking for service, it is a great career. You do learn great skills, and even more importantly, you're doing the right thing by your country by looking to protect it. And I sort of hark back again to Corporal Hooley, the paratrooper who was killed in Ukraine, and his death letter, which just absolutely says it all. I mean, I've posted again on my own feed, just saying, everybody read this. The derision that us people in the military have been getting from all sides. Well, thank God there are a few people who are prepared to step up and do things. And again, the argument that we get, probably from old sort of warriors like myself, saying that the modern, the youngsters are not up to it. People said exactly the same in 1939, exactly the same in 2013. I think they absolutely are up to it. And I'd recommend anybody who's got a bit of substance and a bit about them to go and do it, because it must be a terrible thing to go through life untested and untried and not put under pressure. You only really learn about yourself when the chips are down, and I think it is a great thing to do. And the more top quality men and women we have doing it, the less likely we're actually going to have to get involved in war. And it goes back, prepare for war to prevent it.
My final question, if they're in front of you now, do you have a message for the dictators and authoritarians of the world?
Well, I'd have several messages. I'm not sure it would be all terribly useful, because, as you say, authoritarians and dictators, these are autocrats who are driven by, their own means. And certainly my experience of seeing the Russians and Putin in Syria, they have absolutely no concern about civilian casualties or collateral damage or anybody else except themselves. That is a real hardship. And I suppose the final thing that I'd say here is, to me, Putin is an idealist. He's an idealist.